My name's Sean Newell, and I have the privilege of knowing Anne-Marie Chischilly, our speaker, for some time, and had a chance to work with her. And it's Anne-Marie's the executive director of ITEP, the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. It's based at Northern Arizona University and here in Flagstaff. And ITEP serves NAU, the campus there, state and federal agencies, and nearly all of the tribes and Alaska Native villages nationwide. Anne-Marie is also an attorney, a member of the International Bar Association, and an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, the Dene people. Anne-Marie speaks both nationally and internationally on topics of Indian law, environmental law, climate change, traditional knowledges, water law, tribes, and indigenous peoples. She works with the UN and federal advisory committees and is, in short, very humble, but a very big deal. We're lucky to have her here. So I will turn it over to you, Anne-Marie, and then we will figure out the technology as we go.
Great. Thank you, Sean, and thank you for the invitation to come speak. It's always fun to share some time with people that have like minds, and I think that's what we are today. Coming to you from Flagstaff, Arizona. These are traditional lands of 11 tribes in this region, in the foothill of what we call in the Navajo language, the Dokohozli, which in the English language is something different than some techniques. I am Dene, enrolled at the Navajo Nation, and it's in our custom that we introduce ourselves according to our clan system. So I am Jayamot Atanet, Wachingishan, Torichin, Deshichin, Hanarachni Edeshiche, Deshgizmi Edeshinella, in the Shantpo, Adechimbo, Ayusamasha, but our sunshine, not air on this for. I don't know if we have any Dene in the room. I can't see anybody on my screen, so I'm flying solo here, so I can't see my audience. But if you're Dene, if you're not Dene, I just said that I'm with the Red Streak in the Water Tobacco people, or for the Bitter Water people. My maternal grandparents are the one who walks around, and my paternal grandparents are Wolf's Paw. I'm originally from Shanto, two small communities called Shanto and Shanto, and those four clans and this whole introduction make me the woman that stands or sits before you today. So, Sean, I can't see anyone, so I was going to ask a question, and I was going to have you put it in the chat box, but for some reason I can't see where everyone's from. But you told me y'all from the western region of the United States. Is that correct?
7 western states, yeah, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. I think I got them all.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. All right. So today I'm going to talk to you about what I do in my professional life. I work with an institute on campus at NAU, and I've been here for about 9.5 years. So, and ITEP has been in existence for 28 years. So they've been working with tribes long before I came along. And it originally started with a gentleman named Virgil Seisga. Let's see.
Anne-Marie, please, we just got one request. If you wouldn't mind speaking up a bit, we just don't want to miss everything you say.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's right. I was going to use my outside voice.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, here we go. Is that way better? Can you hear me?
That is way better.
Okay.
Yes.
I was told I need to buy a mic, so I'm just like, no, I know how to talk loud. So just to give you an introduction about ITEP, we've served 95% of all the tribes in the United States. And if you don't know, there's 574 tribes in the United States, and almost half of them are up in Alaska. What we do is, let me see if I can get my slides to work. We do trainings throughout the country and conferences, professional assistance, policy development. But this is what the mediums that we work in. We work on both ambient, outside air, and indoor air quality issues. We work on water quality and access to water issues. We work on solid waste issues, which is all your trash and garbage, landfills, underground storage tanks, toxic waste sites. We look at climate change, and in this picture you'll see we are seeding the sand dunes just north of us on the Navajo Nation. This is the climate program that's growing quite exponentially. We also have a great internship for our students. We have suspended, but it's still a renewable energy program that we work on with tribes as well. This is our policy development group. We work with six tribal partnerships where we meet specifically with the EPA, and I use the last administration's pictures, so just let you know. And then lastly, we're working with food security issues, and this, if you don't know him, is the current president of the Navajo Nation, Jonathan Nair's son, and we have them put in a garden in their yards. So these are all the areas in which ITEP has served in the last 28 years, and we currently serve today. So a lot of work. I have a great team of 50, including all our students, that go into the field and really train individual tribal professionals who work for their tribes, and also state and federal officials as well that work with those tribal officials. So this is what ITEP does. I said 74. We go from 74 to 73 all the time, so we change a little bit, but these are all the tribes that ITEP has worked with. So if you can, pre-COVID, we were traveling quite a bit to go out and travel. Over the summer, though, we had the great task of putting everything online, so including 2 major conferences that we had in the last month. So very proud of my hardworking team, but these are all the tribes throughout the United States. I didn't know quite exactly how many, where we're going to all be coming from, but these are the tribes on the Colorado Plateau. And if you can see, just in this region, we have about 31 tribes. I did not go into Montana or Idaho, but there's a lot of tribes up there as well. So just to let you know, my nation is in the red, which is the largest nation in the country, and then we surround the Hopi Nation, which is right in the middle. So if you're here in Arizona, you're looking at 21 tribes. We look at almost 27% of all the lands in Arizona are consumed with tribal lands. And water rights, I'm a former water rights attorney for the Gila River Indian community, which is just south of Phoenix. If you look at that little stair-step reservation, that's the Gila River Indian community. Prior to coming to ITEP, I was a water rights attorney. And I want to show you a video because I know one of the things we want to talk about are impacts. And we did a video a couple of years ago with ITEP that really just talks about what's happening in Indian country. So I'll let that one go. Well, here's everyone. I stopped sharing.
Climate change is impacting communities around the globe. Among those most impacted by climate change are Indigenous peoples, whose reliance on and traditional connectedness to the natural environment are imperiled by climate-induced changes to the landscape, weather, and plant and animal communities.
I'm also concerned about Alaska in general, which is a very large state. They have erosions, and they have loss of sea ice, and they have homes falling into the ocean. They have coastal problems. And in the interior and in coastal areas also, they have tremendous amounts of permafrost that's melting, and that impacts their infrastructure, and they have to redesign how they build homes because the permafrost is melting.
As noted in the most recent edition of the National Climate Assessment issued by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the consequences of observed and projected climate change have and will undermine Indigenous ways of life that have persisted for thousands of years. Native cultures are directly tied to native places and homelands, and many Indigenous peoples regard all people, plants, and animals that share our world as relatives rather than resources. Language, ceremonies, cultures, practices, and food sources evolved in concert with the inhabitants, human and non-human, of specific homelands.
And we were unable to get oyster larvae for a little while, and I think that was, shot across the bow. It takes a while for these impacts to show up, and when they show up, they can be sudden and they can be really big.
In our case, it's not just the fisheries, it's the fact that our economic development lands are in those same low-lying coastal areas, so we expect to see hits on that at some points. Regardless of whether we see it or don't see it or think it's happening or not, it's here, it's happening, it's already creating changes.
In concert with efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, referred to as climate change mitigation, many tribes, states, federal agencies, and local governments are preparing for the impacts of climate change by developing climate change adaptation strategies. In September of 2014, the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, or ITEP, convened an instructional team and workshop participants in Portland, Oregon, for a tribal climate change adaptation planning workshop. This workshop was developed through support from the USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station and in collaboration with the University of Oregon Tribal Climate Change Project, the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and Oregon Climate Change Research Institute.
Of concern for the area I work for are salmon and the destruction of salmon habitats and ocean acidification and the impacts on their shellfish because they're a coastal community. Those are their main resources.
These are resources they've relied on for centuries. The salmon fisheries, the other fisheries, the shellfish. It's a very deeply ingrained traditional activity in the sense that if that went away, you'd be taking away a large part of their culture. It's based around that.
Tribes are concerned about everything in the environment because everything's interconnected and everything relates to the health and well-being of the individuals as well as the community.
Well, another silent killer, I think, is depression and mental illness. We're finding more and more how tied that is to people who feel like they're losing their lifestyle. Sharing the berries and the fish are such an important part of traditional life. And when you're not doing that anymore, that really takes away part of your identity.
It just touches every aspect of indigenous life. Touches the culture, loss of ceremony, loss of language because you're no longer able to practice or hunt those species or to fish those fish. To me, this emphasizes your total connection to your environment and your species and your people. And to say climate change is impacting these resources, you can't have an impact on a resource without having an impact on the people.
So we have just sort of the symbols and literally the food of the tribe, feeling like it's on the line. So that's what I'm doing. That's why I'm here.
The Portland training brought together a network of tribal environmental professionals and tribal partners. The curriculum focused on climate change adaptation planning and implementation for tribes throughout the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon, Washington, and Alaska.
The shellfish industry did respond. They've done a lot with buffering the water, and there are larvae, and they're also kind of regrouping and doing some of the shellfish growing in Hawaii where waters are less acidic. So there are responses that are working.
One of the things that we're doing in Southeast Alaska is looking at the cedar and trying to say, okay, it's not doing so well in southern Southeast Alaska. Can we help transplant it and help it move to northern Southeast Alaska? In other cases, maybe we'll be able to do some restoration on the landscape, whether it's provide more shade on streams that helps keep the temperature of the streams cooler. Looking for ways to mitigate the potential impacts.
Some things are more easily adapted than others. The homes that are on the shoreline or those wells, probably relocation is possible. It can be very expensive or it could be very complicated. Salmon habitat is a little harder. We're not going to move rivers.
We need to know, who our potential partners are. We expect to be working with other local communities, local governments, as well as federal agencies and others, because these issues are way bigger than Swinomish. I mean, they're bigger than any single governmental entity to deal with in a lot of cases. So it requires looking at partnerships to help pull that off in terms of responding.
We're really interested in climate change and tribes, partly because the Forest Service, the government, has a government-to-government relationship and responsibility to work with tribes and to preserve tribal resources on federal lands.
And on a big picture level, what are the political things that tribes can do to begin to address this and in a meaningful way, since they are feeling all the impacts, they aren't causing the problems, and yet they're losing their culture and their resources because of climate change. So those are the things that are important to me. And how do you find the partnerships? How do you find the concerned people? How do you find the alliances that would support the tribal position?
One of the other projects that we've had in Southeast Alaska is bringing together elders with young people, having the elders share the stories, share the history, share the culture, and the ways of being with young people that maybe they're not doing with their parents, their families as much, and engage the young people in being more sensitive to and understanding about change and climate change and what it's going to mean to them. And I think hope, hope is really important, and engagement and feeling that you can make a difference and that you can have sort of control of your destiny.
I think the quest for indigenous knowledge, to incorporate that into regulations and to incorporate it into planning, not just for the indigenous people, but for the United States, is important. And I think to pursue those kinds of efforts, to go back to what was the balance that the indigenous people had, how did they live in balance, and what do we need to remember or to reframe to capture that. And it's not saying going back to the ancient ways, but going back to the lessons of the ancient ways and bringing it forward into the world that we live in today.
The Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals was created in 1992 to act as a catalyst among tribal governments and research and technical resources at Northern Arizona University in support of environmental protection of Native American natural resources. ITEP established its Tribal Climate Change Program in 2009 to provide support and be responsive to the needs of tribes that are preparing for and currently contending with climate change impacts. This program offers training, technical assistance, educational resources, and tools to build capacity of tribes to address climate change impacts. To learn more, visit our website at www.nau.edu/ITEP.
Okay. Sean, can you stop that? I don't know how to stop it. Okay. Oh. Can you hear me now? Or am I back on?
You're back on, and I gotta figure out where this is. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, I am stopping that now. There we go.
I wanted to show that
It's
video.
2 o'clock.
Sorry, I wanted to.
Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Good.
All right. Sorry, guys. I wanted to share that video because I wanted to see, I wanted you to see what ITEP does. And that's we started our program in 2009, and that was a while ago, for most of these issues have started, and we've been doing that, and we've been growing. That was one program in 2014, but we've been We're now up to 4 programs a year, 4 major 101 courses. We included a 202 class. We also just a week ago, we hosted one of the largest climate conferences in the world. We had over 2,400 people from 30 countries come. So our program has grown exponentially since that video. But a lot of the concerns that I saw in that video still ring true, and then a lot of the problems that we're seeing with COVID and how that's exacerbated with Indian country as well. It's just because of the lack of resources, the lack of infrastructure. So one of the things I usually talk about is, even though climate change is here, COVID is here, we look at adaptation. And adaptation for tribes in the United States in general is not a new concept. We've been doing it for years. If you know the history of the Navajo Nation, there is what we call our long walk, where we were forced to move to New Mexico and kept there for 4 horrible years, and then we were one of the lucky ones to allowed to come back into this region, the region where we're in now. So that's not new. I mean, the same for the Cherokee Nation. They were on what's called the long walk. They were forced to move. Many tribes were forced to move to Oklahoma. A lot of our lands were taken by force and then sold without any royalties moving forward to any of the tribes. So we lost a lot of rights. We lost a lot of land, and our communities were lost as well. And this is just adaptation. Then came the boarding school period, where children were literally stolen from their parents and forced to go to boarding schools, even states away, and then not allowed to wear their own clothes, speak their own language, and these are all federal policies that have changed tribes as they are today. So as we go into this time of climate change or even COVID, it's not new. I believe that one of the things that we have is resilience, is we fight really, really hard, and it's almost like a don't give up attitude. We just keep going no matter how bad it is. So the National Climate Assessment, this is NCA 4, NCA 3 that I'm looking at here. And I wanted to bring this up. This is the official report to Congress. And in this report, if you can tell, here's all the chapters laid out. But if you look at chapter 12 here, there's only one tribe that specifically mentions the tribes or any race at all, and that's for tribes and indigenous peoples. And it was because a major statement that came out is that these tribes, impacts would be especially severe for tribes. And you just learned it through the video. It was because of their subsistence lifestyle. It's the way we live with the earth. If you look in Alaska, 80% of their food and water comes from the tundras, river, and ocean around them. So you imagine 80% of your food today and 80% of your water today, you have to get somewhere other than your house. That's what tribes are looking at in the Alaskan regions. And then you layer on the fact that climate is changing very, very quickly. So just gathering all those essentials for the day, it's getting harder and harder. I also wanted to look at what traditional knowledge is and the recognition of it. I worked on the Federal Advisory Board with the Department of Interior, where we had to sit and explain to all the top scientists what traditional knowledges are. And then we were able to get it approved. And so that in the future, this was 2015, from then on, we were able to say that you have to recognize traditional knowledges when you're working with tribes in climate change initiatives. So this is the official report that Secretary Jewell, and then subsequently, like under the EPA, under their Office of Land and Emergency Management Office, they then came up with considering traditional knowledge during cleanup process. So traditional knowledges began to come into the conversation. How do you apply them when you're working with tribes? And this is the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. This looks at both that looks at Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and how is traditional knowledge is being used. They have a roster of experts to actually consult with them on these issues. So as you know, respecting traditional knowledge came into play right around the administration change, when we were looking at just respecting science. Remember these marches at the beginning of the administration? Well, there's indigenous scientists that also came out and they endorsed that, but they also asked for recognition of Western science, but also indigenous language and indigenous science as well. And then at the United Nations, as Sean said, when I work with indigenous peoples, we're working throughout the world, we're looking at protecting indigenous peoples, which is, you have tribes in the United States, First Nations, and Canada. But if you look collectively at all the indigenous peoples throughout the world, that's what we're called, indigenous peoples. So when the United Nations is looking collectively at how to help tribal people and indigenous peoples, they look at their land rights. And they look at their land rights because 80% of the biodiversity is still within the indigenous people's land because it's still intact. So protecting our global as a whole means protecting indigenous rights. So one of the questions I think was asked is, how do you engage with tribes? One of the first things I always say is, educate yourself about the tribes. Colonization, how the tribe, if you're working specifically with one particular tribe, I would encourage you to look at their foundation. Is it treaty? Is it executive agreements? Also acknowledge that it's a nation within a nation. So if you imagine Switzerland fitting into the United States, that's a nation within a nation. And that's what the tribes will expect you to know if you're engaging with them on these types of issues. Understand what sovereignty means for them. There's a huge federal trust responsibility where tribes sign treaties or sign executive agreements, and the federal government has all these responsibilities: education, healthcare, land, water, that needs to be met. So if you're working with a federal agency, those are things you should be understand. But another big one is the consultation process, because it's a nation-to-nation relationship. Really looking at how you're consulting with the tribe is important. Are you working with the correct people? One big mistake a lot of people make is they choose one person, and that person is expected to speak for the entire nation. Unless that person is the president and has the authority of the council, then I agree that works. But if not, please be careful about that. Also look at the government structure. There's different types. Take, for example, some have the three systems: executive, judicial, and legislative. But then there's also other tribes that have like an elder council. And the Hopi Nation is the example. They have elder and Hopi councils that also consult with the three-tier government as well. And lastly, look at where they're standing. If you're bringing them legislation, as many of you, as this conversation is, look at where they stand on climate change. The Navajo Nation, even though they had 3 power plants within their reservation boundaries, they came out with a climate adaptation plan, which ITEP helped them with. So very happy, but it was this was within the last couple of years. The Swinomish Nation, which is on the video, they were the first nation that came out. And I would say right about now, even there's 73 nations, there's about 110 nations with adaptation plans in hand. So we've got quite a bit of work to continue to move forward with helping tribes develop a plan for themselves.
Anna Marie, we have about 10 minutes left, and would you mind terribly if we move to some questions from the group?
Okay,
or
if you this section right here, that would be
sure.
I'm almost done.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. Another thing I just want to say is acknowledge the land that you currently reside on. No matter where you are in the United States, at one point it belonged to a tribal nation. That's essential for reconciliation. It's something I did at the very beginning. And then when you travel onto tribal lands, make sure that you thank the host. Another thing, only because I work in water rights, is that make sure you understand the politics around water, especially in the Western states when you're engaging with tribes. And then these are just common sense things that we're working on. These are all the levels that you can work on, like local, state, and national. And then I'll just leave it there. Go ahead. We'll start with questions.
All right. Well, thank you for being such a beautiful person inside and out, for the incredible work you're doing for tribal people all across the nation. We really appreciate you coming to talk with us today, and thank you for all the great recommendations you've given us, because we as CCL are really concerned and focused on working with Indigenous people. So one of the questions from the chat is, how can CCL help or collaborate with ITP? We have started an Indigenous peoples group. What should be our focus in your opinion? How do we create trusting relationships with tribes considering the 500-year history of broken treaties separating families and taking away lands from First Americans? Tied to that question is another person saying, I'm asking myself the same question, which is the best way for me, a CCL volunteer, a white woman, live in the country and pretty isolated, to meet with Native Americans in Montana and discuss their concerns about climate change and CCL's carbon fee and dividend solutions, as in the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Thanks for your help with this. My husband and I lobby our Republican senator, and I write lots of letters to the editor and op-eds, and try to engage with conservatives to help influence our representatives here. Sorry for the huge question. I think you covered some of this in your presentation. Thank you for that, but anything else to add?
Actually, it's my next slide, so great.
Okay.
Great. Intro to my next slide. Engaging with climate on climate initiatives. I would say the most important thing that you can do is in the design phase, whether it's with a project or in this case the legislation, it's really important that tribes understand that they are part of they are in that design phase, or else it, like anything else, they feel left out and they feel like their nation to nation relationship is not being met with you when they're not included. Understand there's a lack of capacity on tribal nations. There's usually not a designated climate change program unless they have a grant. So it's not normally within the tribe's budget to put that position in. So normally they're grant funded. So you may or may not have a direct person to work with. A lot of times they don't have funding to travel. So that's one thing you may offer, stipends if you have meetings. This is when we're back in the normal working world. So offer teleconferences and notes from the meeting to have them understand where you are in the process that you're in. Post-COVID, I would highly recommend that you host a meeting out on the reservations, just to get a lay of the land and understand their concerns. A lot of people don't understand just how difficult the traveling could be, or how infrastructure like broadband or Wi-Fi is highly complicated once you get onto tribal land. So really understanding those types of issues is important. When you're building relationships, look at consent. Look at whether or not they are, your tribal folks that you're working with is consenting to what you're working with. Try to build towards that, because a lot of times tribes have, multiple issues happening at one time, especially around water, and that's why I bring it up. When water comes into play, understand that water rights may conflict with tribal, with climate issues. So just be aware of those issues. I've seen that come up multiple times. And then reciprocity, understand that, what you're asking of them, give something. So it's back and forth. There's one big issue under climate change is that's traditional knowledges. And if you look at the last bullet point, it's guidelines for the use of traditional knowledges. This is online. You can look it up. and just understanding how do you protect those traditional knowledges when you're engaging with tribes. So these are some of the recommendations I give everyone. Is there any more specific questions that I'm missing? I don't want to use my time up, but these are the basics.
I think that's really good. There's another question in the chat that I think, with CCL, we're really about building a trusting relationship and respect for people of all places and times and diversity, basically. And one of the tenets that we have heard of is that we are responsible for our actions 7 generations in the past and 7 generations into the future. And how do we get around that if we're trying to build a trusting relationship?
Maybe I don't understand get around.
Oh, well, if what has happened today is because of 7 generations of behavior in the past and into the future, it sort of landlocks you into not being able to break through that and change, perceptions and trust towards non-tribal people.
Okay, I think the first thing is acknowledging it, understanding whatever tribe you're working with, or if you're working with a collection of tribes. I would say, let me go back a little bit. On this level, these are all the, when you're working on legislative issues like you're working on, there's local, state, and national, as we all know. When you're working on the local level, you're looking at tribal leadership. The more you can meet with tribal leaders and get to know them and get to know their issues, remember, it's a nation-to-nation relationship. Work with their tribal liaisons. Every tribe has a tribal liaison working with the public. I would engage with that person, understand that it's a slow process, understand that it may take a few meetings before you even get to the part where you're talking about the legislative issue. You're building that relationship. At the state level, there's many tribal consortiums. In Arizona, there's the Intertribal Council of Arizona. In the Northwest, somewhere in the Northwest, there's the affiliated Northwest tribes of Indian tribes. So there's a lot of consortiums that collectively take tribes from the region to work with them together. Then you also have a lot of state and tribal representatives that are elected. I would work with them as well, or county elections. At the national level, there's one that's called the National Congress of American Indians. And this is where, if you want this legislation to be looked at more closely or endorsed by tribes, I think there's over 250 tribes in the Congress now. I would work with a tribal liaison because they would be sponsoring the bill that you would be putting before a council or the Congress. So really understanding, really understanding that that this takes a long time, and these are the different ways that you can actually start working with tribes. Hopefully that answers your questions.
It does, and we only have 1 minute left. I guess I could squeeze one more question in, but Sean, did you want to wrap it up? Okay, I'll go ahead with one last. Oh, okay. One last question really quick. And once again, thank you so much for everybody who joined this call. And Anne-Marie, you have been absolutely invaluable to us in helping us move forward with climate work on tribal lands together with tribes. One last question. Is there any particular kinds of carbon emission reductions that tribes are working on? And I know that's a huge one and we only have 1 more minute, but is there anything you can tell us about that?
I think in the Northwest, the affiliated tribes in the Northwest, Indians are working on their forest issues. So they're working collectively on those types of issues. I don't know if they've moved into the whole market yet, but I know they were looking at how they can develop their forest better.
Okay, thank you. Sean, I know we do have 2 resolutions in favor of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act with 2 chapters in Cameron, right, Sean? So, but I'll let you end it.
3 so far, and those have been really wonderful experiences for me to go to chapter meetings and have people stand up and say, we really want to do something. Here's something we can do. We're glad to do it. So that's been the payoff for some of that time investment that you're talking about. And it is an investment of time and relationship. So thank you so much for sharing what you know. This recording will be available so all of us can have references back to it. Anne-Marie, thank you for joining us today, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Everything. Take care.